Let's reflect further as we're joined by Professor John Stremlau from the Department of International Relations at Wits University. Professor Stremlau, a good evening to you. Thank you for joining us. I think let's just start off that back of South Africa's role, because we just saw in that package by Newzroom Afrika reporter Latasha Naidu in the streets of Cape Town to Parliament. Ordinary South Africans, there was one mom there who was brought to tears, just thinking about it from mother to mother, seeing the visuals that we've been seeing over the past year now has been heartbreaking. What do you make of South Africa's efforts, from the ICJ to the protests to our government stance when it comes to what's going on between Gaza and Israel?
Well, I applaud South Africa's attention and reminders of the plight of the Palestinians, because the Palestinian state is the critical element in this equation which could ignite a peace process. But I don't see, frankly, Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, in the short term, relenting at all. And I go back 30 years or more to earliest reactions by Netanyahu to the two-state solution that the U.S. had tried to negotiate, and he has been opposed to that for forever, and he's now in alliance with the hard right, and so he is hell-bent on at least trying to get Donald Trump to win in the U.S., and so he'll have a friend in the White House, and Kamala Harris would be at least responsive to, although it's in the campaign right now, so you can't really forecast, but nevertheless, she would certainly be more responsive to South Africa's appeals for the Palestinians. And the Palestinians, if they were granted a state of their own, would unlock the Abraham Accords between the Israelis and the Saudi Arabians. And, you know, there's no love lost on Iran, but it's all ethnic and it's all tribal. And I just despaired by the attitudes of those in the region. There is no Mandela and no de Klerk, and I wrote about that in the aftermath of the October 7th last year, the incursion into Israel by Yahya Sinwar. He is very hard-nosed, and as is Bibi Netanyahu. And it's so a recipe for continued fighting.
It is a recipe for continued fighting and disaster indeed, as we're seeing it spreading across the region as well, which is what the South African president was also warning against. But when speaking about the upcoming US elections and whether Trump wins or whether Kamala Harris wins and what that would mean for having a friend in the White House, some might also say that the U.S. support of Israel since even before October 7th has what has also emboldened it. And that was through Biden's administration as well, where they were backed with support.
Absolutely. You're not wrong on that, Masa. And I despair, but I also understand the history of the pogroms in Europe, and then the settlers arriving, the Zionists, and wanting to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians, when what you could have if liberal forces were in play is a South African type solution to the endless fighting between ethnic groups. Why not have a constitution that would allow for the self-expression of Palestinians and Jews and everyone? But that's not to be in the Middle East, and I despair, because the settlers who came down from Europe in 1948 made it plain that they were hell-bent on eradicating the Palestinians, and Bibi Netanyahu is the worst of the worst on this. There are moderate voices in Israel who could be persuaded to stand up for a more fair solution for the Palestinians, a statehood that would could be reconstructed and satisfactory to all parties, including the rest of the Middle East. But you're not going to see that with as long as Bibi Netanyahu is in power, and Bibi Netanyahu is very close to Donald Trump. And so I'm hoping that Kamala Harris will win, and that Kamala Harris will find a way to add muscle to and make the weapons provisions more dependent on a peace process that is a two-state solution that the U.S. has traditionally favored.
Yeah, and when we continue, I want to continue this conversation with you, Professor, after the break, just to talk about what you've mentioned there as well, that close relationship between Bibi Netanyahu and Donald Trump. He also, of course, bragged about it during that U.S. presidential debate between himself and Kamala Harris, saying that had he still been in power, that we wouldn't be in this position in the first place. But we'll take a very quick break, and then we'll come back and continue that conversation. Welcome back. We continue our conversation with Professor John Stremlau from the Department of International Relations at Wits University about the conflict in the Middle East. Now, Professor, before the break, we were talking about that relationship between Donald Trump and, of course, Bibi Netanyahu as well. And I mean, he says openly all the time that, look, they do have a good relationship. At that U.S. presidential debate, he said that had he still been in power, this wouldn't have even happened in the first place. But as you've also already alluded to, this didn't start on October 7th. This dates back to decades and decades from, of course, the first occupation there. But he seems to believe that he'll be able to quell this conflict that is taking place in the Middle East as well. Should he not win? Should he not win and Kamala win? Should he not win and Kamala Harris does win? Kamala Harris also has said that Israel has the right to defend itself, and the U.S. will continue to support it, as much as she has said that, look, what is happening in Palestine is also wrong. So there also does seem to be saying one thing, like talking the talk, but not necessarily walking the walk. Because if you really want it to end, why don't you withdraw the resources that you're pumping in?
You can't draw a moral equivalence between Kamala Harris, who at least recognizes the realities of a deep allegiance between, and for reasons that relate to the pogroms and before that, but also don't forget that Kamala Harris wants to see America look more like South Africa, a home for all who can live there, and the diversity and inclusion, whereas Donald Trump wants to return America to white Christian males, and he has made that very clear in his MAGA approach, and so therefore he understands ethnic nationalism. He supports ethnic nationalism. He at the restriction of Palestinians, and he identifies with Putin, and says he could end the Ukraine war in a day by granting Putin what his wishes are. He would support Bibi Netanyahu, as he did when he moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And I know that there are certain followers within the United States body politic who think this would be a great solution. Let Israel cleanse Israel of the Palestinians. But I don't think that that's the future of our universal values that South Africa has so rightly applauded at the World Court, at the ICJ, and in calling out Israel for what effectively is a genocide against the Palestinian people.
Prof, recently world leaders met in New York for the 79th session of the United Nations General Assembly. And there we had one world leader after another, including President Joe Biden, who were condemning these attacks on innocent civilians in Palestine as well. We also had the UN Secretary General saying that the scale and speed of killing is unlike anything that he's seen in many years as Secretary General, and saying more than 200 of their own staff at the United Nations have been killed, and their family members as well. Journalists as well included in that, innocent civilians, medical staff, people who are trying to provide aid as well. Who would Benjamin Netanyahu listen to if he won't listen to a world power like the US, if he won't listen to world leaders who are gathered at the assembly as well, who also walked out on him?
Well, look you're in a world of nation states, and most of them from Europe. The settlers were, as the nationalists and the white minority down here, protective of their particular ethnic identity and racial identity, religious identity, whatever. And Bibi Netanyahu went to the UN and was very defiant, and was also not including a Palestinian state in any of his maps that he waved in front of the General Assembly. And then he banned Guterres from traveling, the UN Secretary General, to the sovereign state of Israel. And he's betting that the US will back him in the veto. Well, you know, Putin was a Security Council veto member, permanent member, and he vetoed all of the appeals for peace in Ukraine and Russia. So we are in an evolving situation where South Africa is a voice for universal values, and it did table that very powerful moral arguments at the World Court, but the World Court does not have any of the enforcement mechanisms of a sovereign state. And so we're caught between a world of sovereign states that are supposedly equal and independent and sovereign, and universal values like political equality and justice for all. So you're stuck.
Yeah, it's a rock and a hard place, yeah. Professor Stremlau, always a pleasure to gain your insights as well. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.